back! Stand back now!
You can't arrest her! Stop it! I said quiet!
Leave her alone.
Stop it! Get off me! Get off me! Get off me!
When silence became the loudest weapon. Harlem, New York, carried a heartbeat of its own in those days. It wasn't just the rhythm of jazz spilling from basement clubs or the echo of footsteps on Lenox Avenue after midnight. It was something deeper, a shared awareness among its people that dignity was hard-earned and never freely given. Every look, every word, every pause carried meaning. And in that Harlem stood Bumpy Johnson, a man whose presence alone could still a room without him ever raising his voice. That evening, the air felt heavier than usual. The sky wore a dull gray, the kind that pressed down on rooftops and made people walk a little faster. Bumpy sat at the small dining table in his brownstone, his hands folded calmly, eyes steady as he listened to the soft hum of the city outside. Across from him sat his wife, Elise, composed, graceful, and quietly strong. She had learned long ago that being married to a man like Bumpy meant living with tension she could never fully escape, yet she carried herself with a calm that matched his own. Their conversation was ordinary, almost intentionally so. Talk of neighbors, a letter from a cousin, the price of groceries creeping higher. They both understood that normal moments were precious. Harlem did not always allow them. When Elise stood to leave the house that night, wrapping her coat tighter around her shoulders, Bumpy watched her with a look that held more meaning than words. It wasn't fear, it was awareness. Harlem had taught him that danger rarely announced itself loudly. "I won't be long," she said gently. "I know," Bumpy replied, his voice low and steady. She stepped into the street, the door closing softly behind her. Minutes passed, then more. Bumpy sat still, listening not just to the sounds outside, but to something deeper, something that told him the night had shifted. He rose slowly and moved toward the window, scanning the sidewalk below. Nothing looked wrong, and yet the air inside his chest tightened just enough for him to notice. Elise was supposed to return within the hour. She didn't. Across town, under a flickering street lamp near a quiet intersection, Elise's path crossed with something Harlem feared but rarely named aloud. A group of men stood near a parked truck, their posture wrong, their eyes sharp with the kind of attention that stripped humanity away from its target. One of them stepped forward, not shouting, not threatening, but invading space in a way that made the message unmistakably clear. Elise froze, not out of weakness, but calculation. She had lived long enough to know that fear could either expose you or protect you, depending on how you carried it. She straightened her posture, meeting the man's gaze with controlled calm. That calm unsettled him. "You walk awful confident for someone out here alone," he said. Her answer was measured. Confidence doesn't belong to men alone. That was when the moment shifted from discomfort to danger. A hand closed around her arm, not violently, but deliberately. Ownership without permission, a statement rather than an attack. And in that moment, Elise understood something important. This wasn't about her, it was about making a message visible. They didn't drag her, they didn't shout, they simply guided her, firmly, toward a space where witnesses gathered. A small crowd began to form, drawn by the tension they couldn't explain. Shopkeepers paused, passers-by slowed, conversations stopped. Nearly 200 people would later swear the same thing. The street went silent. Not the silence of peace, the silence of waiting. Back at the brownstone, BumpyJohnson stood by the door, coat already in hand. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. Men who survived Harlem long enough learned that speed without purpose only created mistakes. He stepped outside. Harlem watched him move. Word traveled faster than sound in those streets. People leaned out of windows, doors cracked open. A whisper followed him, not fear, but recognition. BumpyJohnson was not a man known for chaos. He was known for control. When he reached the intersection, the crowd parted instinctively. No one announced him. No one needed to. He saw Elise. He saw the hand on her arm, and he saw the eyes of the men who believed they had chosen the right moment to make a point. Bumpy stopped walking. That alone changed everything. The man holding Elise smirked, as if expecting an explosion, a shout, a threat, a move that would justify what came next. But Bumpy didn't give him that. Instead, he spoke quietly. Let her go. Not a demand, not a plea, a fact. The man laughed, sharp and short. You think you run every street now? Bumpy's eyes never left Elise. I don't run streets. I stand on principles. The crowd felt it then, that shift in the air when something irreversible was happening. No fists were raised, no weapons drawn, just words, carefully chosen and placed with precision. Bumpy stepped closer, slowly, deliberately, making sure every person watching understood this was not about intimidation. It was about witness. You're holding my wife, he continued calmly. But more than that, you're holding this block hostage to your ignorance. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The man tightened his grip slightly. A mistake. Elise spoke for the first time since Bumpy arrived. Do not, she said firmly, confuse silence with fear. 200 people stood frozen, not because they were afraid of violence, but because they were watching dignity challenge cruelty without flinching. Bumpy finally looked directly at the man. Tonight, he said softly, you have a choice. You can let go and walk away remembered as nothing, or hold on and become an example of weakness hides behind hate. No threats, no promises of harm, just truth, spoken in a way that left no room to escape it. The man hesitated, and in that hesitation, Harlem held its breath. When a crowd learns the meaning of control. The hesitation did not last long, but in Harlem, seconds had weight, and that pause felt like a chapter in history unfolding in real time. The man holding Elise shifted his stance, glancing not at Bumpy first, but at the crowd that had silently transformed into something more than witnesses. Faces that once looked away now stared directly at him, not with anger, not with fear, but with a kind of collective judgment that pressed heavier than any shouted threat ever could. He had come expecting dominance, expecting chaos, expecting that fear would scatter people and leave him powerful in the center of it. But instead, he found himself surrounded by stillness, and stillness unnerved men who relied on noise to feel strong. Bumpy remained motionless, his posture relaxed yet immovable, like a pillar rooted deep into the street itself. He understood something the man did not, that crowds did not need instructions to recognize truth when it stood plainly before them. Elise's calm presence, her refusal to beg or shrink, had already shifted the balance long before Bumpy arrived, and now his words had given shape to what everyone felt but could not articulate. This was no longer about one woman or one confrontation. It had become a test of whether intimidation could still survive in a place that had learned the cost of silence. The man attempted to regain control by speaking louder, his voice edged with forced confidence, but the sound cracked against the air instead of cutting through it. His words felt empty, stripped of authority the moment they left his mouth, and the crowd did not respond the way he expected. No one shouted back, no one moved. That absence of reaction drained his power faster than any argument could have. Bumpy let the moment stretch deliberately, knowing that impatience belonged to those who lacked certainty. He understood that dominance imposed through fear collapsed when faced with restraint that refused to be provoked. Elise felt the grip on her arm loosen almost imperceptibly, not because the man had decided to release her, but because uncertainty had entered him, and uncertainty weakened his resolve. She did not pull away immediately. Instead, she straightened further, asserting her presence without a single aggressive motion, allowing the crowd to witness dignity reclaiming space inch by inch. That choice mattered. It showed everyone watching that courage did not require spectacle, it required steadiness. Bumpy finally spoke again, not raising his voice, not accelerating his words, but grounding them in calm certainty that left no room for misinterpretation. He addressed not just the man before him, but everyone present, transforming a private threat into a public lesson. He spoke of how fear had long been used as a shortcut to power, how cruelty disguised itself as strength when challenged by nothing, and how communities suffered when they mistook silence for acceptance. His words carried no hatred, no revenge, no promises of retaliation, yet they struck deeper because they forced reflection rather than resistance. Even those who disagreed could not deny the composure with which he stood, and composure had a way of exposing insecurity wherever it hid. The crowd began to shift, not physically, but emotionally, as individuals realized they were no longer alone in what they felt. Shop owners stepped closer to their doorways, elders crossed their arms with measured resolve, and younger faces watched with widened eyes as they witnessed a kind of power rarely demonstrated. This was not the power of fists or weapons, it was the power of moral authority, and it unsettled anyone unprepared to face it. The man holding Elise understood then that whatever message he intended to send had been reversed, reframed, and turned against him without a single blow being struck. When the grip finally released her arm, it happened quietly, almost shamefully, as though the act itself wished to go unnoticed. Elise stepped forward, not rushing to Bumpy, not collapsing into relief, but standing beside him as an equal presence, her calm reinforcing his words without adding new ones. That image burned itself into the minds of those watching, a couple standing unshaken before hostility, not demanding applause, not seeking validation, simply refusing to surrender dignity. The man attempted one last assertion, muttering words meant to reclaim face, but they fell flat against the collective silence that answered him. He backed away slowly, not chased, not threatened, but diminished by the realization that he had lost control in the very place he thought fear would grant it to him. The crowd did not cheer as he retreated. They did something far more powerful. They remained still, watching, ensuring that he understood this moment would not be forgotten or distorted. As the tension dissolved, Harlem seemed to exhale, yet something fundamental had changed. People did not disperse immediately. They lingered, absorbing what they had witnessed, understanding that they had participated in something larger than themselves simply by refusing to turn away. Bumpy placed a hand gently at Elise's back, guiding her forward not as someone rescued, but as someone who had stood her ground and helped reshape the outcome. That choice mattered. It showed everyone watching that courage did not require spectacle. It required steadiness.
Walking back through the streets, Bumpy felt the quiet acknowledgement of the community around him. Not admiration, not fear, but respect, rooted in understanding. He knew this night would be talked about in barber shops, kitchens, and church steps, not because of confrontation, but because of restraint. Stories would grow, details would blur, but the lesson would remain intact. Power that relies on cruelty collapses when confronted by collective dignity, and silence, when chosen intentionally, can become the loudest force of all.
When stillness became a memory no one could escape. The night did not end when Bumpy and Elise disappeared down the street, because moments like that do not dissolve with footsteps. They linger, embedding themselves into the walls, the sidewalks, and the minds of everyone who witnessed them. Harlem did not return to normal immediately. Instead, it entered a quiet phase of reflection, as if the neighborhood itself were processing what it had seen and what it now understood about its own strength. People spoke softly that night, not out of fear, but out of reverence for the realization that had settled among them. They had discovered that unity did not require coordination, and courage did not require noise. It required presence. Inside his home, Bumpy removed his coat slowly, his movements deliberate, his expression unchanged. Yet beneath that calm surface, his mind was already moving through consequences. He understood better than most that moments of moral clarity often provoked backlash from those who felt exposed by them. Silence humiliated the arrogant far more deeply than confrontation ever could, and humiliation had a way of breeding resentment. Elise noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, not as fear, but as responsibility, and she did not interrupt his thoughts. Their partnership had always been built on understanding without explanation, on shared awareness that leadership came with costs that could not always be spoken aloud. Across the city, whispers traveled through circles that rarely overlapped with Harlem's daily life, reaching places where power relied on intimidation and reputations were sustained by unchecked cruelty. The story, retold and reshaped with each telling, carried one unchanging detail: a crowd that refused to scatter, a man who refused to threaten, and a woman who refused to bow. That combination unsettled those who depended on predictable fear, because it revealed a weakness they preferred to believe did not exist. Fear lost its reliability when people learned they could stand still together and survive. In the days that followed, Harlem subtly shifted. Shopkeepers looked strangers in the eye longer than before. Neighbors intervened sooner when disrespect appeared. Conversations that once stopped at discomfort now continued into honesty. No speeches announced these changes, and no banners marked them, but something fundamental had retaken root. People had seen that dignity could be defended publicly without descending into chaos, and that realization recalibrated how they viewed their own roles within the community. Harlem began to recognize itself not merely as a place that endured pressure, but as a place capable of responding to it with discipline. Bumpy became aware of these changes not through praise, but through absence of provocation, absence of the subtle threats that once tested boundaries. Those who relied on intimidation chose distance instead of challenge, sensing that the ground beneath them was no longer as stable as it once seemed. That absence confirmed what Bumpy already knew. True authority did not announce itself. It reshaped behavior quietly, forcing those around it to adjust or retreat. Elise, meanwhile, carried the experience differently. She understood that her composure had become part of the story, and she accepted that responsibility with humility rather than pride. Women approached her with looks that carried unspoken gratitude, seeing in her an image of strength that did not rely on aggression or defiance, but on self-possession.
She never dramatized what had happened, never exaggerated her role, because she understood that exaggeration would cheapen the lesson. Instead, she spoke calmly when asked, emphasizing not what she endured, but what she witnessed, a community choosing not to look away. The man who had initiated the confrontation faded from public view, but his absence spoke louder than his presence ever had. Those who once aligned themselves with cruelty recognized that something had changed in the equation of power, and that association with open intimidation now carried risk rather than reward. Fear, once weaponized with ease, now encountered resistance in the form of watchful stillness, and that resistance proved difficult to counter. Harlem did not celebrate, it did not parade, it did not declare victory. Instead, it absorbed the moment and allowed it to refine behavior. That restraint preserved the integrity of what had occurred, preventing it from becoming spectacle or myth. It remained a reference point rather than a rallying cry, a reminder that dignity defended collectively could alter outcomes without leaving scars. Bumpy understood that the greatest test of leadership was not the moment itself, but what followed it. He knew that maintaining calm authority required consistency, and that one powerful stand could unravel if not supported by continued restraint. He continued his routines unchanged, spoke when necessary, remained silent when silence served better, and reinforced through action what words alone could not sustain. That consistency reassures the community that what they had witnessed was not a performance, but a reflection of values deeply rooted. As weeks passed, the story settled into Harlem's shared memory, no longer raw, but enduring. It became something parents referenced when teaching children about self-respect, something elders recalled when discussing the cost of courage, something that lingered quietly whenever injustice attempted to reassert itself. The image of 200 people standing still became symbolic, not because of what they prevented, but because of what they demonstrated, that collective dignity could interrupt cruelty without becoming it. And in that understanding, Harlem changed, not overnight, but permanently, having learned that the most powerful moments were not always the loudest, and that sometimes the decision to remain still could move history more decisively than any force ever could.
When legacy was defined without a single strike, time did what it always does best after moments of quiet upheaval. It revealed which changes were temporary and which had settled deep enough to become permanent. Harlem did not transform overnight into a place free of tension or injustice, but something within it had recalibrated, like a compass needle finally finding true north after years of distortion. The memory of that night no longer felt sharp, yet it remained present, influencing choices in ways people rarely noticed until much later. When confrontation threatened to escalate, voices lowered instead of rising. When intimidation surfaced, it was met not with panic, but with awareness. The lesson had not been written on walls or spoken from stages, yet it traveled farther precisely because it had not been forced. Bumpy understood that influence carried a responsibility heavier than authority, because authority could be enforced, but influence had to be earned again every day. He never spoke publicly about the incident, never allowed it to be used as a symbol for personal elevation, and never corrected exaggerated retellings unless they threatened to distort the truth at their core. In private, he reflected often on how easily that night could have unfolded differently, how one impulsive decision could have turned restraint into regret. That awareness kept him disciplined, reminding him that leadership was not proven in moments of anger, but in moments where anger was resisted despite having every reason to exist. Elise, too, felt the long echo of that night, not as trauma, but as clarity. She recognized that strength was not something revealed only under pressure, but something cultivated long before it was tested. Her composure had not come from instinct alone, but from years of choosing self-respect in small, unnoticed ways. She shared this understanding quietly with those who sought her perspective, emphasizing preparation of character over preparation for conflict. Her words carried weight because they were not dramatic, they were grounded in lived experience, and people listened because they recognized authenticity when they encountered it. Beyond Harlem, the story continued to ripple outward, stripped of names and locations, retold as a lesson rather than an incident. It became an example discussed in places where fear had long dictated behavior, illustrating that cruelty depended on reaction, and without reaction, it lost its leverage. Those who heard the story did not always change immediately, but the seed was planted, and seeds, once planted, had a way of growing in unexpected conditions. Even those who dismissed it felt unsettled by it because it challenged assumptions they relied on to justify their conduct. The crowd of 200 became less important as individuals than as a symbol of what could happen when people refused to participate in their own intimidation. Many of them never spoke publicly about being there, yet each carried the memory forward, influencing decisions in subtle ways. They intervened sooner, supported one another more deliberately, and recognized the quiet strength in simply showing up. The power of that collective stillness lay not in numbers alone, but in shared resolve, and that resolve continued to surface whenever dignity was tested. Bumpy aged, as all men do, but his legacy solidified not through stories of dominance or control, but through stories of restraint that outlived him. People remembered not what he took, but what he refused to do, not who he silenced, but how he allowed others to find their voice through example rather than command. That distinction mattered because history had seen enough men remembered for destruction, but far fewer remembered for discipline. His influence endured because it did not rely on fear to sustain it. Years later, long after the faces from that night had changed and the street itself looked different, the lesson remained intact. Parents spoke of it without embellishment, elders referenced it when patience wore thin, and younger generations absorbed it as part of the neighborhood's unspoken code. The idea that silence, when chosen deliberately and shared collectively, could interrupt cruelty became part of Harlem's identity, shaping responses long after the original context faded. And so the legacy of that night was not defined by confrontation, but by composure, not by force, but by unity, not by words shouted, but words measured and placed with care. 200 people standing still had proven that dignity could command space without claiming ownership of it, and that understanding outlived every rumor, every threat, and every attempt to erase it. In the end, what Bumpy did next was not a single action, but a standard he upheld, one that showed the world that real power did not need to announce itself, because when it stood quietly, others chose to stand with it.